Thank you, Gursharan sir, for joining this episode.
Hi, Maninder. Thanks a lot for having me. You have already mentioned my name. I'm Gursharan. I did my post-graduation from NITI back in 2012. And since then, it's been 11 years. For the 11 years, I've been working in different sections of what we call as supply chain. My career started with a tire organization. It was a CEAT tires back in 2012. It was a campus placement. Did about 5 years there. Then around about 4 years in McDonald's. And then close to 2.5 years in Olam. So total about 10 to 11 years of work experience. And I think in terms of what roles I have done, it's kind of divided. If I have to categorize or classify, around about 40 or 50% of my career had been in buying roles, predominantly commodity buying. Not just commodity buying, but there had been some non-commodity and indirect expenses also, which I had handled for some of my organizations. But largely, I would say commodity buying was heavy in that portfolio, which I had handled across the organizations. Then about 2 or 3 years in planning, inventory planning, logistics, operations, contracting, sourcing of logistics, warehousing, and all those kind of services. And then about a couple of years in my last organization were more in a slightly leadership kind of a role where I was not hands-on with any of these specific role definitions. It was more of a mid-level leadership role. And there were, of course, people under me, people who were doing planning, taking care of logistics operations. So yeah, that's about me.
Thanks a lot for introducing yourself. I think you have covered very well. I know personally that the deep dive you do in the roles where you work and you try to cover the breadth of that role so that you can give your best is something which I personally really appreciate. And I'm sure that from today's episode, the audience will also be able to relate how you approach different things, whatever kind of assignment you take care. And for any commodity buyer, it's not just a buying, like market analysis, supplier management, understanding the dynamics, everything. So this episode is going to cover lots of things on that angle. So starting from very basics, for example, what basically commodity is? What is the definition, theoretical or practical? And what does it mean when anyone says commodity buying or I'm a commodity buyer? So on very basic levels, if you can explain.
I think commodities, from a very textbook definition point of view, commodities basically are basic materials or basic goods, serve as mostly as the raw materials or inputs for the production in various companies. Again, from a very textbook definition point of view, I think what a commodity is basically a material or a good which has very easily identifiable specifications or very easily identifiable characteristics. And normally there are multiple suppliers or multiple sources available to supply this commodity or raw material to whichever companies need it. So I think that's what it basically means. And when we say a commodity buyer, then of course I was watching the previous episode of Ms. Imani, and she had given a very nice overall holistic viewpoint of what all different supply chain roles are. So in that entire chain of supply chain, starting from the raw material procurement right down till the end where the final product is delivered to the customer, I think commodity buying is probably the most upstream role, for an organization's supply chain. So it's a person who would, undertake the activity of buying a certain material for his or her company, a material which acts as a constituent to the production processes. And the role has certain demands. When we say commodity buying, as a sophisticated management professional, you're supposed to deliver certain results or certain, outcomes when you undertake the role of a commodity buyer for your organization. It is not just a simple buy process. You just buy it for your company and it arrives at your factory premises. You have to be very good at that commodity. Again, I'll cite the same example that Ms. Imani was citing in the previous podcast, about someone in one of her organizations who had been handling base oils for Castrol for decades. He or she knows in and out of the commodity. Absolutely everything. What are the suppliers? What is the material like? What are its basic characteristics? How is it transported? What usually influences the pricing of that commodity? So as a commodity buyer, that's what you need to get involved in. You have to get into the thick of the things. You have to have all the basic know-how of the commodity. You have to understand in detail how the pricing mechanisms work. Of course, it varies from commodity to commodity. There are certain commodities which also get traded on certain financial exchanges, wherein you can do trading of those specific commodities. So whether the commodity is a traded commodity or not, and that kind of reveals the pricing swings of those commodities which get traded on the exchanges. Then, of course, not all commodities get exchanged. There are certain commodities, mostly I would say derivatives, which come from, let's say, crude oil, for which there are defined value chains in terms of how the pricing mechanisms or in terms of how the pricing inflations or deflations get passed on, depending on the most basic price of the crude oil, the Brent crude oil. Similarly, so of course, this commodity buyer, this person, of course, he or she has to know the supply points. He or she has to know the sources. He or she has to know how the pricing works. He or she also has to have a good idea about how to plan for that commodities arrival in the factory or the warehousing premises of the company, and what quantities that has to be bought. Also, in terms of the demand, or in terms of the requirement of that commodity, how much of that commodity is required. The value of that commodity, of course, plays a big role in terms of deciding what level of focus has to go into that commodity from that buyer's portfolio point of view. Okay. So if that commodity constitutes, let's say, a very big portion of the company's expenses, then it becomes all the more important for the management to devote more time in terms of bringing costing efficiencies for that commodity. So I think that's how I would define the role of a commodity buyer.
Yeah, I think the way you have explained it, it's very clear that it's not an easy job to be a commodity buyer. I think you have covered all the aspects. Like, the commodity buyer cannot ignore one aspect of the business. In itself, it's like handling a business in itself, like understanding the dynamics of the market, the financial aspects, the operational aspects, how much this commodity is going to impact money part of that company. When you are buying something, you have to be very considerate about the costing, how it's going to impact the costing, and then the final product costing as well. And then warehousing and etc. and inventory, XYZ, like different aspects of this. And somehow you have covered the sourcing also, like how the sourcing happens. But still, I think if you have to quickly like just share the basic sourcing process of any commodity, maybe you can take one example, how it works, and what are the basic steps.
So I think, like I said, if it is a very major portion of your expenses, then the first thing that you need to have for that commodity is a strategy in place.
Okay.
You need to develop a strategy in alignment with your management in terms of how you're going to approach the entire sourcing of that commodity. When I say strategy, it basically refers to which all suppliers or which all vendors you're going to deal with from the current set of vendors, as well as in case there are any new vendors that you would like to have on board. Also, depending on whether the commodity is an imported one or a domestic one, that also plays a major role in terms of all the strategic inputs that go behind that commodity. So you also have to decide about what kind of inventory levels that you have to have for that commodity, which would of course depend on the lead times and the service levels of the vendors that are there in the industry. Also, in case you want to go for any new vendor developments, let's say you feel that there is a merit in going for new vendors, which you want to, let's say, take benefits of certain duty-free exemptions, which can be availed while importing from certain countries, or even within domestic industry also. Or let's say, you can be in a scenario where you had been dealing with only imported vendors, and then all of a sudden, a local vendor comes up in the market. Nothing beats a local vendor in terms of, the kind of benefits that a local vendor can give to you, especially in terms of service levels and in terms of inventory levels. So, of course, you would also want to have a local supplier also in place. So those kind of things are, I think, what play as the input parameters for developing a strategy for the commodity. Then the second level, I think, of course, in terms of the entire commodity buying process would be the tactical aspects of the commodity, which would be, when I say tactical, it's somewhere between strategic and operational activities with respect to that commodity. With respect to tactics, it could be something like, so let's say you have a commodity, in which you want to allocate business to suppliers on a month-on-month basis, or you have to allocate the business on a quarterly basis. Let's say the pricing, changes with that kind of a frequency on a quarterly or a monthly basis. So you have to again drop new purchase orders and then issue the new business allocations to the supplier. So how do you allocate the business to the different vendors depending on your relationship with them, depending on their performances? When we say their performances, typically I think the vendor ratings are what most companies resort to in terms of measuring their vendors' performances, and the typical parameters of vendor ratings being delivery, quality, cost. And then usually there is a subjective fourth parameter called as a service, which some companies bring in to give a certain merit or certain marks to the vendor for how they've been performing in terms of, let's say, any specific or any exceptional situations. So that's how you would rate the vendors, and depending on these parameters, you of course costing. I think for commodities, most of the commodities, they run on very thin margins. So of course costs do play a very big role. So you decide on the business allocations for the vendors. Then also inventory levels, how much inventory levels you want to keep, whether you want to take any positions with respect to the commodity. Let's say the commodity might be hitting all-time low prices. So you could be thinking about maybe buying some extra material for the time being, so that you can have it in your factory premises or warehouse premises, or you can also tell the supplier to keep the inventory at their premises, and then that maybe you would have staggered shipments with time. But then basically you want to block that commodity for as long a time as you can at that specific low price level which exists at that point of time. So those are typically the tactics which you have to resort to from time to time. Also, in case you are buying any imported items, then certain countries have FTAs, free trade agreements with India. How to utilize those duty-free licenses that your company would have. So these kind of things, I think, typically are what I would say are the tactics of a buying process, of a commodity buying process. And then third, of course, being the operational aspects of the procurement, issuing the purchase orders to the suppliers, doing the follow-ups, ensuring that your inventory levels are not below the safety stock levels in your warehouses. Also ensuring that, any actions are taken immediately if, let's say, there are any quality-related rejections or any issues. So acting on those things on a day-to-day basis are what I think would qualify as the operational part of the entire procurement process with respect to commodities.
I think the critical aspects are beautifully covered by you. How to start from the strategy and then executing the strategy, and then making sure the strategy is aligned to how on a ground level we have all the metrics in place, which are then further aligned to the company's growth and company's targets, which they have planned for current and the upcoming years. So when you were sharing about the commodity, what commodity is and how the whole canvas looks like, you mentioned important points, which I will further would like to touch in this part of the episode. I'm sure that commodities will come with some risk also, because you have to be updated about the market, you have to study about it. Then there might be some events which you can never think about. For example, some war happens all of a sudden, but you would never want that to happen. And now because of that war, the impact is directly coming on the commodity. So that is something which you cannot predict. But there are certain parameters which you can easily predict, and you can think how you will stay up to date with the market, so that you can plan accordingly. And then further deep diving into it, there are multiple risks which are associated with it. So I'm just mixing two aspects of this profile and the commodity buyer, the work he or she does. So if you can just elaborate on this part, that how it works and how risky, how difficult it is, or whether it is easy or not, maybe on those lines.
So Maninder, if I have to define risk, I think with respect to commodity, there are broadly two kinds of risks. One is with respect to the pricing, and then second risk would be with respect to the supply. So, going wrong on pricing, of course, means that, you would have ended up buying the material much higher prices than the existing market prices. Or it could also be taking a wrong position, especially for, companies which are in commodities business. Which companies like Olam, Cargill, which are predominantly into commodities business, they just buy commodities from the origins or places close to the origins, and then they do a very little basic value addition to those commodities, and they make living basis the trading of those commodities. They buy at a certain price X, and then they sell that commodity at a X plus Y price. So they have to ensure that Y, which is the margin, which is the overheads plus the margins, that has to be healthy enough for them to for the financial prosperity. So for these companies, of course, pricing risks play a very big role. Going wrong in terms of the pricing of one commodity for them can completely lead to a haywire in their entire P&L. So basically, these companies, they have different P&Ls for different commodities, because normally I think different commodities constitute different businesses for these kind of companies. Each commodity is like a subsidiary in itself. So going wrong in terms of a year-long pricing position of a commodity can completely play havoc with the P&L of that particular year for that specific commodity. There are certain companies, like especially the FMCG companies or the manufacturing companies or the pharmaceutical companies, who do not buy just one commodities. Their final products are normally an amalgamation or a mixture or a combination or a blend of different commodities or different materials. So for them, going terribly wrong on one commodity may not lead to a massive hole in their P&L. But of course, that doesn't mean that they can be lax or they can be too much relaxed with respect to these their commodity buying aspects. A commodity buyer goes wrong on the position of a commodity for an FMCG company or for a pharmaceutical company, and because of that wrong position, they ended up paying an extra 1 crore rupees, paying that much amount more than what the competition was offering. Now 1 crore for a 5,000 crore sales revenue kind of a company, that is roughly about 0.02%, I think. Yeah, that's about 0.02%. So even 0.02% is a massive erosion of your margins. Just going wrong on one commodity, just one wrong decision on one day, 0.02% losing on that kind of margin, it's a big deal. So of course, but for companies like these, they can, I was talking about companies which are in FMCG space or in pharmaceutical space or in manufacturing companies, which are not buying just one commodity for their finished goods. They're buying multiple commodities. So they're, of course, to some extent, even if they do go wrong on a certain commodity, to some extent, they can cover up the grounds, by bringing cost efficiencies into other commodities. But of course, you have to be careful, because sometimes the value that you will leak, you may not be able to compensate that by, bringing whatever efficiencies you can bring into other items.
Correct.
The other risk with respect to commodities, like I said, would be with respect to supply. So you don't, as a commodity buyer, your job is not just to buy at the best price possible, but you also have to ensure the supply of that commodity. And for that, you need reliable vendors. You need vendors who fulfill their commitments. So, of course, we don't live in an ideal world. Things do go wrong. And I think COVID was definitely one such time where I think almost anyone working in supply chain can testify that there were massive disruptions in terms of the supplies, in terms of deliverables from the vendors, and there were different reasons. There were reasons largely external and uncontrollable, but then of course sometimes these reasons can be arrested on a very proactive basis if the vendors are up to the mark. So you will want to have the right vendors in place for ensuring that the quantities committed by them do reach your factories or your premises. So that is with respect to the supply risk of the commodities portfolios. There's no point in buying at the best price possible if your vendor cannot deliver the material to your factories, because if it doesn't come in the factory, that means the production will get hampered, and that means you will end up having a hole in your revenues.
Correct.
Now coming down to the second part of the question which you asked, with respect to how to stay updated on the commodities. So of course there are multiple things that you can do. You can of course start with staying in good relationship with your vendors, with your suppliers, maintain a good rapport with them, keep talking to them regularly, keep engaging with them, keep discussing what's happening in the industry. At times, your vendors will be the ones who will tell you a lot of information, especially if you can build a very good, open, transparent relationship with any of your vendors, with whom you can openly discuss things at a very informal level. That will help you a lot. There were a lot of times when I would go to my vendors and ask them for information, and they would be very supportive in terms of giving me the information or enabling me with whatever knowledge they felt that I should have. Also to stay abreast with whatever developments are happening there in that specific commodities space. Those developments could be, let's say, there could be a new factory coming up somewhere in the world. It could be in India or it could be abroad. By when are those companies expected to go full stream in terms of the production? If there are any shutdowns planned for any of the current vendors, their factories, it is important for you to know that also, because sometimes a factory shutting down for a very prolonged period of time can lead to inflation in the prices, because the supply goes out for that particular commodities for whatever time the factories are shut, and that means that for that specific time period the prices can shoot up. So being aware of these aspects. Of course, there are other ways to stay abreast with the commodity. You can you or your company can subscribe to port data. So I think a lot of companies, they subscribe to port data on paid basis. I think it is also available on free of cost basis. Also, some agencies probably provide that. I'm not aware about the names of those agencies. I think zoba.com is one of them. But they, of course, I think they also have a paid version in which they would provide you more bit of information which could be helpful to you for analyzing the commodity. So when I say port data, it of course refers only to the imported commodities, imported materials. It will that kind of a data you might not get you will not get it for the domestic items. Then other things that you can do, one thing that I used to sometimes do is, subscribing to Google Alerts. You just go to google.com, or Google has this feature called as Google Alerts. So just go to Google Alerts and type in the keywords of your commodities. So let's say if you're buying copper, or let's say you're buying zinc from Hindustan Zinc Limited. So you put Hindustan Zinc Limited in the Google Alerts keywords, or you put zinc. Of course, if you put zinc, a lot of things will come up in the Google Alerts, because that will throw up an entire ocean of things. So you have to be smart with what kind of keywords you're using. You can use whatever keywords you feel are the right, which will give you the specific information that you need. So Google Alerts is one thing that you can do. Other than that, I think I've covered the relationship aspect with the vendors, port data, Google Alerts. Of course, if your company can subscribe to any publications, because for a lot of commodities, certain agencies or certain institutions or certain entities, they publish the prices of those commodities that are being the prices which are there in the open market.
Yes.
So I think I've seen this for crude market, crude oil, for crude oil derivatives, and also for the food products also. I've seen these kind of websites which provide a weekly or a monthly kind of pricing data to you. So you or your company can subscribe to this information and reading the reports, reading the news that come up in these publications with respect to the commodities. So it's kind of important to have a feel of that commodity, what is happening in that commodity.
Correct. These are the things which can fairly cover majority of the aspects. And I think the first part which you covered, where you mentioned about suppliers, I think that is one of the important links to have, because sometimes suppliers, those who are very close to the product manufacturing, they might be having additional benefit of getting the knowledge way before these publication reports. But at the end of the day, I think the combination of all this, what you mentioned, using Google, then suppliers, and then these reports, should be more than enough to give a very good idea of the commodity and what is happening in the market. Coming to the last section of this episode, so there are two aspects which I think we should be covering, which are mostly related to the application point of this knowledge and how this space works. Can you help in understanding or sharing 2-3 examples from your past experience? Could be from procurement, from other aspects of supply chain, logistics, planning, where you were able to use information collected through suppliers or publications or some other sources which you mentioned, and take some informed decisions which helped the company, or maybe like some failure might have happened or some successes might have happened. So whatever you want to share, so that we can understand the application point of view.
Since you have used the word failure, so I think sometimes, of course, we have to also admit that we can go wrong in certain things. Our decisions can also backfire. They can also create issues or troubles for us, out of which we have to come. So I think, of course, like I said, most of my commodity buying roles had been a little bit in the past. I think like 3 or 4 or 5 years back, that's when I had done mostly these commodity procurement roles. If I have to think of some examples, I think one example which I remember quite very clearly, because I went wrong in that thing.
Okay.
And I got a bit of a dressing down also from the management for that. So it's something that has always been there in my memory. Of course, I cannot reveal much details. So it goes like this. I think it was year 2014 or 2015. I was in CEAT, and I was in charge of buying the synthetic rubbers for the company. So most of the synthetic rubbers back in those times used to be imported from countries like Iran, Korea, Thailand, and I think Brazil or somewhere in South America also had one of the suppliers. Then there were 1 or 2 suppliers in Europe. So mostly they were imported from overseas. There was a new supplier who was coming up with a facility in North India. We all, when I say we all, the tire companies, we all were looking forward to that supplier, because it was such a refreshing thing for us to happen that after these years and decades, we're getting a new supplier for that specific synthetic rubber grade, probably the first one of its kind in India. So we were all quite excited about that supplier coming up, and we were working quite hard to onboard that supplier. We were doing the trials of their materials. We were chasing our R&D and our technology departments to approve the samples, to approve the commercial lots. And then finally, after about 12 to 18 months of efforts, we were finally able to approve the vendor. Now, for me, the story goes like this: that since it was an imported item till then, So we used to stock about 15 to 20 days of inventory across our factories and warehouses. And we were all really excited about this new vendor coming up, and whatever little bit quantities we had bought from them for the sake of approvals, for small quantities that we would buy for trial runs. Mostly the prices, I think, were very good. Prices were like 3%, 4%, 5% down compared to what imported vendors were offering. So we were really excited. We were very enthusiastic about this new vendor coming up. That we'll be able to reduce our prices. We'll be able to reduce our inventory levels down to 10 days, 5 days kind of levels. And finally, just a few days before that vendor was to be onboarded, we kind of decided that we'll bring down the inventory levels, so that we can immediately start sourcing the material from this new vendor, and we can then from that point onwards, assuming everything will go smoothly, we'll keep just 5 to 7 days of inventory levels, and we'll be able to also capitalize on the savings that vendor was going to offer in terms of the landed prices. The moment that time came, I remember very clearly, I think it was the beginning of a month. So for that material, normally the vendors used to offer the prices in the first week of the month. So I was keenly waiting for the prices of that vendor to come up, so that I can immediately just allocate a heavy portion of my requirements to that vendor. And then finally, when the prices came from that supplier, I think they were like shockingly 7, 8%, 9% higher than the landed prices of the imported items at that point of time. And unfortunately, for me, I had no inventory in pipeline. I had no imports. I was operating on like I said, I was operating on just about 5 days, 7 days, 8 days in inventory levels in anticipation of this new domestic vendor that he will solve my inventory problems also. He'll do a great job for me in terms of my inventory KPIs also. But of course, we ended up taking a massive hit, for that entire and that synthetic rubber grade. The value of that specific grade in terms of the buying value of that grade was very high. I don't remember the values exactly, but it was definitely multiple crores of rupees every month. So going wrong by 7, 8%, 9%, was a massive dent for that particular month or for that particular quarter. So I got a bit of a dressing down from my management later in terms of this entire strategy that I had put in place to welcome that vendor. So that's one of the times I remember. The other example I can give is again with respect to synthetic rubbers. I think somewhere in 2016, early 2016 maybe, or maybe somewhere in the middle of 2015, the crude oil prices, the Brent crude had reached all-time lows. I think it was down to like I think $25, $30 per barrel levels, which were like kind of all-time low. Most of the synthetic rubbers, not most, in fact, almost all the synthetic rubbers, they are basically made from feedstocks, which are basically derivatives of the crude oil chain. So there are different carbon chains which come out from the crude value chains, and then one or two of these carbon chains, they lead to the feedstocks, which eventually are used for the manufacturing of the synthetic rubbers, which get used in entire industry. From the crude, a lot of carbon chains are derived from the crude oil value chains, and different carbon chains lead to different kind of materials, different kind of derivatives. And, I think one or two of these chains basically form the feedstocks, which are then eventually used for the manufacturing of synthetic rubbers, which in turn are used for, used in the manufacturing of tires. So in a way, synthetic rubbers prices are linked, to the crude oil prices also, not in a very direct manner, but there is definitely a healthy amount of correlation. So I think somewhere in mid 2015 or end of 2015, the crude oil prices were kind of all-time low, and it was almost apparent that they cannot go further lower than this. Okay. So we guys decided, means me, my reporting manager, the HOD, as a team, we decided that we're going to take a big position on this particular grade of synthetic rubber. Typically, we used to keep like 5 days, 10 days, or maximum 15, 20 days of inventory for that specific grade. We, in one purchase order, to exploit the opportunity that was there for us to take, to exploit the opportunity of buying at all-time low prices, we issued a purchase order for about almost, I think, 4 or 5 months of stock. It was almost like, I think, I don't remember the quantities now, but I think in one purchase order only, we bought roughly about 4 to 5 months of our requirement. And of course, we were not going to be able to take all this material at once. So we requested the supplier to send the shipments in a staggered manner over the subsequent 2 or 3 months, so that, rather than being settled with all this inventory all at once, we would, rather have an inventory level of, let's say, 20, 25 or max 30 days. And, even the incremental warehousing cost that came up with storing about 30, 35 days of that specific grade, they were absolutely nothing. They were like a grain of sand in the entire beach or in the entire ocean, against the savings that we were able to generate from that specific opportunistic buying we did. Okay. So I think so those are the kind of calls that you have to sometimes take as a commodity manager. That's why I said that, you have to be very alert in terms of what are the things happening in the industry. And these opportunities will definitely come up, because most of the commodities, they kind of follow a cycle, which could be anything from 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. They kind of, have their swing lows. They kind of also have their swing highs. And when the prices are near their lows, that's where you have to time your purchases. Of course, you might not be able to target or might not be able to achieve the absolute bottom, but even if you're, let's say, 2%, 4% or 5% close to the bottom, that's, I think, more or less you have done a good job as a commodity buyer if you can purchase in scenarios like that.
I think this is something which you shared for one commodity, for example. Now, if someone is managing multiple commodities and multiple suppliers, so this must be difficult, I'm sure, like handling so many commodities at one point of time, then handling those suppliers also, and taking risky calls like what you are sharing, and then making sure that your calls are getting executed in a positive manner as planned. So how that is done in the industry, like when you have multiple commodities to manage and multiple suppliers, and you have to make sure you are taking good calls, helping the business, and avoid the failures as max as possible.
So, Maninder, the question is more in terms of bandwidth management, or more in terms of how you address these different spends from a monetary point of view, from a financial implication point of view?
Mix of both. Like when you were saying that you had to take a very big call for multiple months of inventory against your general plan, but you were mentioning that there is one category you were handling or the commodity you were handling. But I was thinking that if any person who is handling 2, 3, 4 type of different commodities, how the bandwidth, like what you said, will go, how the monetary point of taking decisions can impact the company, and how to make a good balance of it so that strategy is executed in a planned way. I'm just curious that how that must be happening in the industry if someone is handling multiple commodities and talking to multiple suppliers at the same point.
I think there is no clear-cut answer to this. It would depend on a lot of factors. It would depend on what kind of company you're working in. It would depend on the mix of portfolios that you have, or the mix of commodities that you have in your portfolio. It would also depend on what exactly your role is. Is it just of a strategic sourcing buyer, or are you also involved in terms of the buying operations? When I say buying operations, that includes activities like issuance of purchase orders to the suppliers, following up on the supplies, following up on the logistics also, and also intervening very regularly whenever there are any issues in terms of materials not reaching on time. So it depends on all these factors, but I think a thumb rule, if I have to give a thumb rule, it has to first start with the value of the commodity. What kind of values. You can go by a very classical ABC kind of a classification. Classify your items into A, B, C, depending on how much value they have in terms of your overall portfolio. So the ones which are, in the top 60-70% of value bracket, they will generally be just a few items. Going by that typical Pareto rule, they will be around about 20 or 30% of the items that you handle, the ones which contribute 60-70% of your portfolio. So they will be the items wherein your maximum attention will be required in terms of pricing aspects. When I say pricing aspects, that would include activities like negotiating with your vendors, drawing up the contracts with your vendors, whether they're annual contracts or biannual, or let's say it could be 6 month or 3 month kind of contracts with the vendors, or even monthly spot contracts. So that's how you would allocate your time in terms of the pricing related activities of your commodities in the portfolio that you have. Other aspects will be in terms of inventory levels. So of course, there are certain items, especially the ones which are very volumetric in nature, wherein your company does not have very adequate infrastructure to, it might not have adequate infrastructure to store those items. You have to run on very lean inventory levels. Therein you will be involved, or you'll be absorbed a little bit more on an operational level. You'll be absorbed on a day-to-day inventory levels. What are the inventory levels? You will want to ensure that your inventory stays in that min-max range which you have defined for it. You will not want it to drop below min. You will not want it to go above max also, and that min-max range could be very tight. So a lot of your bandwidth could be sucked into ensuring the operational aspects of procuring that commodity. Other aspects will be the vendors, of course. How many vendors are there? If there are only one or two vendors you're dealing with, then your job is pretty simple. You just have to maintain a basic relationship with those vendors and ensure things are running smooth. But if there are multiple vendors, 3 or 4 or 5 vendors for that commodity, you have to keep talking to all of them for sensing what are the prices in the market, who is giving the best price, who is off price, and ensuring that if you have given contract to any of the vendors who currently on a spot basis is, let's say, way off compared to the other vendors, then you will want to give that feedback to the vendor, and or you will want to work with that vendor to come up with a win-win kind of a situation in which you can ensure that that vendor supplies at the best prices possible, and also that vendor, for their sake, they also get the business that they want to get. So that's how I think your attention will be allocated to different commodities that you have in your portfolio. I think that's all. And also with respect to the high value items, especially if I have to give an example, I think in context of CEAT, we used to have natural rubber, synthetic rubber, carbon black. These were the items, and of course there were some other items as well, but these were the items which formed a major spend for the company. And of course, I had worked in McDonald's, wherein I think potato, dairy, then certain few other items, protein. These were the items which constituted the bulk of the commodity buying for the company. So in these kind of critical components, you also need to have a lot of management to management interaction. If you are an entry level commodity buyer, then you also have to ensure that your boss, your reporting manager, or if required, even the HOD is directly or indirectly involved, or he's updated in terms of what's happening in terms of the procurement of that commodity. It is sometimes very, especially if you are operating in a commodity where, let's say, it's more of a supplier friendly market, or where it's more of a seller, the seller has higher bargaining power over the prices, then I think it is very important to stay in very healthy relationships with your vendors, because they kind of dictate the prices, they kind of run the show, and you don't have much of a say. Let's say you don't have much alternate sources from wherein you can get the supplies, so you're dependent on just 1 or 2 vendors. So it's also important to maintain a healthy relationship with these vendors. For that, you will have to have senior management to senior management kind of interactions happening on a pretty frequent basis. So yeah, I think that's how I would say how your attention should be allocated to the different commodities in your portfolio.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Summed up very well. Actually, in itself, it's a very heavy topic. I think for you, it was day-to-day interaction, or maybe you might be interacting with a lot of people from the industry. But for me, listening to you, I can understand that it's in itself is a very heavy topic to understand, because commodity buying involves lots of factors like what you mentioned. Apart from that, it's not just a plain buy or sell decision. It's something which involves multiple people, multiple stakeholders. You have to do the risk management also. You have to make sure that you are well aware about the dynamics globally, what is happening. So, but I'm sure that I was able to ask relevant questions to you. From your side, you have explained it pretty well. This is what I wanted to end this episode with, and thanks a lot for giving time. I have taken a lot of time from you. I hope you enjoyed this session today on this.
Sure, Manita, thanks a lot. And it had been quite some time that I've been involved in commodities buying kind of role. So I apologize if I have stepped wrongly on any of the things I said. But I think that's how typically things go. And yeah, I would say keep up the good work. I have also seen the other episodes in the podcast, so I think it's a very good initiative. So just keep it rolling.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, and I'll be in touch. Take care.